You know, my allies are always complaining that my outlandish antics and ridiculous plans are going to lead to some sort of inevitable chaos and catastrophe for our adventuring party. Those silly fools. They act like I'm actually planning any of this. Today, we're going to talk about the Swashbuckler in Pathfinder 2e on today's episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I'm a storyteller ready to tell the Swashbuckler in my gaming group. Oh, you want to go for style over strategy? Well, you can certainly try. By the way, shout out to my wonderful wife for this incredible shirt that she got me for Valentine's Day. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today we are continuing my classic introduction series and moving on to one of the most over-the-top classes in all of Pathfinder 2e. That's right, today we're talking about the Swashbuckler. We're going to take a big picture look at the Swashbuckler. We're going to look at its strengths, its weaknesses, and some of the different options that are available for players who are interested in playing a Swashbuckler. And ultimately, we'll discuss what you can do to get the most out of the Swashbuckler at your gaming table. Now, for those of you who may be new to the Classic Introduction series, this is not a deep dive into every single mechanic or class feat that the Swashbuckler offers, but rather it's a big picture overview that helps you get an idea of what the Swashbuckler will bring to the table and what sort of play experience you can expect if you decide to try a Swashbuckler. These videos do take a lot of work and a lot of time to edit and put up, so by all means, please remember to do all of that YouTube stuff that supports the channel. Please remember, if you enjoy this video, like, share, subscribe. You can check out my free Discord or my Patreon. Both of those will be linked in the video description. And as always, the most important thing you can do to help support this channel is to jump down into the comments section, be a part of the conversation, leave your thoughts, your observations, and your tips for getting the most out of the Swashbuckler. But with all of that out of the way, let's get started. Now, in the Classic Introduction series, we examine every class in Pathfinder 2e through the lens of 5 important questions. Number 1, what role does the Swashbuckler play inside of the game? Number 2, what are the strengths of the Swashbuckler? Number 3, what are the weaknesses of the Swashbuckler? Number 4, what build options does the Swashbuckler present? And then finally, number 5, how can I get the most out of the Swashbuckler in play? So let's start with the first question, which I actually break into 3 sub-questions. I like to talk about the class role, the class complexity, and the key terms that are associated with a given class to help us understand the mechanical design and sort of what Paizo intended when they put the Swashbuckler into the game. Now, the Swashbuckler is a class that was introduced to the game in the Advanced Player's Guide for Pathfinder 2e, so it's not one of the original classes, but it's one of the ones that was added a little bit later. And as part of the Advanced Player's Guide, you can probably guess that there's a little bit more to the Swashbuckler in terms of mechanics relative to some of the other classes in the game. And I say that to give you a little bit of warning. Our first sub-question, if you will, is what is the class role of the Swashbuckler? And the Swashbuckler is remarkably focused in its intended role in the game. There are many classes in Pathfinder 2e that can take on a variety of different niches, but the Swashbuckler is very focused. The Swashbuckler is a dexterity-based, melee-oriented martial striker with a strong skill game to back up the rest of its toolkit. Does that seem a little overwhelming? Okay, let's simplify it a little bit. The Swashbuckler is a bit of a hybrid class, if you will, occupying a space between the fighter and the rogue in Pathfinder 2e. It has some incredible combat ability and can dish out a lot of damage, but it also has a surprisingly strong skill game on the back end. It's not as heavy in combat as the fighter, it's not truly superior in skills like the rogue, but it's this nice intermediary between the two. So if you enjoy the fighter and the rogue and you're looking to mix those playstyles, you may find that the Swashbuckler hits that sweet spot. But to break down some of the other things I said, the key ability for the Swashbuckler is dexterity. Unlike some other martial classes, the Swashbuckler is very clear in that this is a class that intends to use dexterity as its key score, and if you are building a Swashbuckler, you are playing into that dexterous, agile warrior concept that you see in a lot of action movies and other media. Additionally, the Swashbuckler's toolkit is built almost exclusively around melee combat. Even though this is a high dexterity class, they don't have a lot of ranged options in their toolkit, and your goal as a Swashbuckler is to get in close and deliver very powerful attacks to the heart of your enemy. And yes, that was quite literally a fencing pun. And of course, that term striker that I mentioned, that's a pretty obvious term. What that means is the Swashbuckler is a class that is intended to deal damage. Your role is to be on offense, your role is to attack, to hit hard, to find ways to slip past your enemy's defenses. So with all that in mind, let's move on to our next subcategory in understanding the Swashbuckler and talk about the class complexity. Every time I do one of these videos, I like to give a class complexity rating to give you a bit of an idea of how much homework goes into playing a given class. Now, to be very clear, I have seen brand new players take some of the most complex classes in a game and do very well with those classes because the player was excited to play the character. If you are interested in a character, do not let the complexity of a character scare you off. Excitement will always outshine having to do a little bit more homework to get your head around the rules. With that out of the way, the Swashbuckler is one of the more complex classes in the game, and I would say of the martial classes is probably the second most complex martial class in the game. I think the Thaumaturge gives me a little bit more of a headache, but the Swashbuckler is not far behind, so I'm giving the Swashbuckler a complexity rating of 8 out of 10. Now, I will say this, I feel like a lot of the Swashbuckler's complexity is a little front-loaded. Once you get used to the Swashbuckler and get used to the routine associated with playing a Swashbuckler, I think this is a class that gets a little bit more simple, and the complexity may drop down to a 7 or a 6 out of 10. I do think that this is a class that once you get the concept, you're going to adapt pretty well to it, but the initial learning curve is a little bit steep, and I do think that any player that is looking at playing a Swashbuckler needs to keep that in mind. But let's talk about where some of that complexity comes from and discuss the key terms associated with playing a Swashbuckler. Oftentimes you can take a shortcut to mastering a class by focusing in on some of the key terms or key concepts that are associated with a given class, and the same is true of the Swashbuckler. And one of the things that I really like about Paizo in terms of how they approach Pathfinder 2e is every single class in Pathfinder 2e has this handy sidebar that tells you some of the most important key terms that you need to know and be aware of if you want to play a given class. So oftentimes you can just flip open the book, look at that sidebar, and get a pretty quick tutorial on the most important concepts that will aid you in playing your character. But if you've seen more than one episode of this series, you probably know that I frequently complain that those sidebars are not quite as detailed as I think they should be, and so we're not even starting with that sidebar on the Swashbuckler. We're actually going to be starting with a core Swashbuckler ability that I think is more important than the key terms themselves, and that is Panache. The Swashbuckler represents the kind of hero that cares just as much how they do the thing as whether or not they succeed at the thing that they're doing. It is about that glorious attempt to outshine everyone around you and living a life full of bravado and excess and just going for the crazy stuff that you're gonna brag about to your friends for years to come, as long as the dice don't betray you. To understand how to play a Swashbuckler, you need to understand that is the style of play that Paizo is directly aiming for. If you like characters who are doing over-the-top stunts because it's fun and memorable, not necessarily because it's the tactically sound thing to do, that's the play experience that the Swashbuckler is attempting to emulate, and that is captured most clearly in the Panache ability that the Swashbuckler has. Essentially, as a Swashbuckler, when you do crazy, ridiculous things, you feel so good about yourself, you get bonuses. If you do something awesome and dangerous and live to tell about it, then you are filled with a sense of bravado that increases your abilities in combat. Now, the first thing you need to recognize about Panache is this is a sort of on-off kind of trait for the Swashbuckler class. If you've played Pathfinder 1st Edition, Panache was a resource that you could gain or lose during the course of play. It's a little bit different here. In Pathfinder 2nd Edition, a Swashbuckler either has Panache or they don't. You've done something amazing and you feel great about yourself, or you haven't achieved that, or possibly you've burned your Panache to do something even more ridiculous. When your Swashbuckler has Panache, you gain a plus 5 foot bonus to your speed, and you gain a plus 1 bonus on all attempts to tumble through an enemy's space. You'll also gain some damage from the Precise Strike ability, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. In order to gain Panache, you simply have to do something ridiculous, over the top, and incredible. Now, Paizo does give us hard, clear mechanics on what this means, sort of. Essentially, every Swashbuckler can gain Panache by successfully tumbling through the space that an enemy occupies. So, by taking that risk to tumble to a better position, you can not only give yourself a tactical advantage, but also give yourself that emotional sense of bravado and cause you to gain the state of Panache, giving you those boosts that we just mentioned. Now, you can only have Panache while you're in combat, so once combat ends, Panache will go away, but you can also lose Panache by spending Panache, and that comes in the form of finishers. So, finishers are the first actual key term that is listed in the Swashbuckler sidebar, and a finisher is a special action that a Swashbuckler can take that performs an attack and usually has some kind of pretty significant effect associated with the attack. Now, I will tell you up front that the word finisher is a little bit misleading. One of the best descriptions I've seen online, people have compared the word finisher to a combo ender in a fighting game. You've landed a couple of good hits, and now that the enemy is staggered, you launch them with a brutal combo ender or something to that effect. The word finisher doesn't mean that you're automatically going to kill your enemy or that the goal is to automatically kill your enemy, but rather it's just sort of a super powerful attack that you can unleash when the moment is right. In order to perform a finisher, you must have Panache, and when you perform a finisher, you immediately spend that Panache, causing you to lose Panache once the finisher is over. There are some additional restrictions that are associated with finishers, such as if you have used a finisher, you cannot use anything with the attack trait for the remainder of your turn. So if you're going to use a finisher, it does need to be a combo ender for the round. You can still use other actions, but those actions cannot have the attack trait. Now, because of this, because there is so much power put into finishers, a lot of finishers will have a failure effect of some kind. A good example of this is the very first finisher you get as a Swashbuckler is called Confident Finisher, and when you use Confident Finisher, even if you fail the attack roll, you still deal half of your Precise Strike damage to the target, even though you technically missed. A lot of the different finishers that a Swashbuckler can pick up are going to have a failure effect like that. Even though the attack missed, there's going to be some kind of benefit associated with using the finisher because it is such an important part of the Swashbuckler's routine. Now, with that distinction comes two important notes. Number one, finishers often have failure effects. failure effects do not apply on a critical failure. So if you botch that attack roll with the finisher, nothing's going to happen. It's going to be a complete waste. The other thing to be aware of is if you succeed on your attack roll with your finisher, there may be some weird circumstance where you actually want the failure effect rather than the success effect, possibly because the failure effect is going to apply a debuff of some kind, and that's completely okay. If you succeed with your attack roll on the finisher, but you'd rather have the failure effect that is better for what you're doing in the moment, that is completely okay. Go for it. Now, in discussing Panache and finishers, I have twice mentioned something that I haven't dived into in depth, and that is the Precise Strike class feature for the Swashbuckler, which is basically a bonus damage feature associated with having Panache. As a Swashbuckler, if you have Panache and you're using an Agile or Finesse melee weapon, including Agile or Finesse unarmed strikes, then you just get a +2 bonus to damage. On top of that, if you're using a finisher and you meet the qualifications for Precise Strike, you actually increase your Precise Strike damage from +2 to +2d6. So essentially, it's a small bonus to damage that is always available, but it turns into a massive bonus to damage when you're trying to use your powerful finisher abilities. By the way, Precise Strike does scale as you level up, so it will become +3 and +3d6, +4 and +4d6, on up throughout the levels. You can almost think of Precise Strike as being similar to a Barbarian's Rage or a Rogue Sneak Attack. It's similar to a Rogue Sneak Attack, especially on a finisher, because you get so many bonus damage dice, but unlike a Rogue Sneak Attack, the enemy doesn't have to have a particular condition like flat-footed, but rather you just have to be wielding an appropriate weapon. And it's also kind of similar to a Barbarian's Rage in that you have a flat bonus to damage, though the flat bonus to damage is a little bit lower compared to an ability like Rage, because you maintain a lot more of your mental acumen when using Panache and therefore using Precise Strike. Now, there are a couple more key terms that are listed for the Swashbuckler, and we have seen both of these key terms before. That is Flourish and Stance, so I'll mention them very quickly, but we're not going to go super in-depth. Flourish is essentially a trait that means once per round. You can only use one action with a Flourish trait in any given round, though you can use other actions that also have the Flourish trait in a future round if you so desire. Flourish is a trait that is meant to represent actions that take a little more skill, a little more emphasis, a little more effort to perform, and so they're not the kinds of abilities that you can just spam over and over again. And let's just go ahead and admit, Flourish is one of the traits that needed to show up on Swashbuckler. We should not be surprised it's here. The other trait that you should be aware of is the Stance trait, and this is a trait that is added to actions that allow you to enter a particular style of combat, a particular stance in combat, that will often have certain specific benefits, but also certain conditions that must be met in order to remain in the stance. Once a character uses an action to enter a stance, they stay in that stance until combat is over, or until they perform an action that would break the stance in some way. And if a character leaves a stance for any reason, they have to wait around before they can enter a new stance. But beyond that, a stance is a reasonably permanent effect that would apply through the remainder of combat. We've seen both of these before with other classes. The final thing that I want to talk about when it comes to key terms and concepts, and this will show up more when we get to question number 4 in this video, but I do want to pause and say, your Swashbuckler style, which is your subclass, is going to give you certain special actions that will affect your ability to gain Panache. The main thing you need to know here is read up on those actions and make sure you understand the traits associated with those actions, because there will be nuance involved. For example, the Gymnast style, you can gain Panache by using actions like grapple, shove, and trip. However, grapple has the attack trait, and you cannot use attacks in the same round that you have used a finisher, so if you use a finisher in a round and you have actions remaining, you couldn't then use grapple in an attempt to regain Panache if that's something you wanted to do. You'd have to wait till the next round. There's a lot of small nuance here, so we're going to shelve this for the moment, but just be aware that when you take your subclass as a swashbuckler, it's going to come with special actions, and you want to read up on those special actions and make sure you understand them so that you are getting the most out of the swashbuckler while you're playing it. But let's move on to some of the more interesting and fun parts of this conversation. Let's ask question number 2, what are the strengths of the swashbuckler? If I choose to play a swashbuckler, what am I going to be good at? And the very first thing that I want to point out here is burst damage. The swashbuckler is in the striker niche. We already mentioned that, but if you couldn't tell from my description of the precise strike ability, the swashbuckler is a class that has the ability to land devastating hits in the right circumstances. Catch an enemy flat-footed, drop a finisher, and just roll an insane amount of dice. The swashbuckler can spit out some absurd damage in the right moments. It can take a little bit of setup to get there, but once you get used to how the swashbuckler plays, you are definitely going to have turns where you're going to be rolling a lot of dice and spitting out some really fun numbers in damage that you are doing to your enemies. They probably called it a finisher because even if your enemy survives, they'll wish they hadn't. Every martial class in Pathfinder 2e has a different take on what it means to be a martial class. Some will focus on ranged combat, some will focus more on defense, but even classes that do focus on the striker role will often have slightly different approaches to what it means to be a striker, and with the swashbuckler, they definitely like to focus on landing those devastating big hits at the right moment. As a swashbuckler, you'll be running around with +2 damage here, +2 damage there, and that'll be nice, but then when the moment is right, you'll drop a lot of dice, and that's where the real fun begins. However, it's not just those big turns where you roll lots of dice that makes the swashbuckler fun to play. Another thing that is a lot of fun about playing a swashbuckler is you have a really good skill game for a martial character. In Pathfinder 2e, the rogue is the king of skills, and the investigator is not far behind. In third place, some might put the thaumaturge, but I'll go ahead and tell you this, the swashbuckler could compete in this category, because the swashbuckler has just a lot of skills and a lot of support for a good skill game. The swashbuckler begins the game trained in acrobatics, 1 skill based on their subclass or style, and then 4 additional skills plus their intelligence modifier. If you add in 2 more trained skills from the vast majority of backgrounds in the game, that means that a swashbuckler with a 10 starting intelligence is going to have more than half of the skills in the game trained at level 1. On top of that, Swashbuckler also starts the game expert in perception and does eventually get up to master in perception, meaning that for a large chunk of the game, you're going to be one of the most perceptive members of your team. Swashbucklers get a lot of trained skills, and as they level up, they also get some free skill feats that are tied either to acrobatics or whatever subclass they chose, meaning that there's not as much of a feat tax associated with being good at skills in Pathfinder 2e. Swashbucklers cannot play quite as good a skill game as the rogue does, but they have a very strong skill game, and it's one of the traits that really helps them stand out as a martial class. So in addition to your ability to drop some pretty impressive damage, you've also got some pretty strong skills to back up that damage in other aspects of play. By the way, this is a little bit of chasing a rabbit, but several of the Swashbuckler subclasses focus in on diplomacy, deception, or intimidate. They focus in on social skills, meaning that the Swashbuckler, if they're willing to invest just a little bit in charisma, they can make a really good party face, meaning your character can have a very clear combat role and a very clear social role with not a lot of investment beyond your basic abilities. The final strengths that I want to talk about for the Swashbuckler are reactions and mobility. So let's start with mobility. Earlier I mentioned if you have Panache, you're just faster. Like, you get a bonus to your speed, and as you level up, that bonus to speed gets larger. And here's the crazy thing. After a certain point, you get to keep some of that bonus to speed even if you don't have Panache, meaning that as a Swashbuckler, you have a really good move speed. No magic necessary, you're fast. And in this game, a good move speed allows you to get to a tactical advantage easier, allows you to find a better space on the battlefield. Having better speed and better mobility is always a good thing. Top that off with the bonuses to tumble through that we previously mentioned. And the Swashbuckler is a character that can get where they want to go basically anytime they want to be there. The other thing that I would like to mention here is Swashbucklers are one of the most reaction-rich classes in the game. You will automatically gain access to a reaction called Opportune Riposte at level 3, and Swashbucklers have a lot of other reaction options just available through their class feats, so things like Nimble Dodge and Attack of Opportunity. As a Swashbuckler, you can get a pretty impressive list of options for how you might use your reaction inside of combat. Now, it is worth noting that until you get to some higher level feats, you only get one reaction a turn, so this is a strength that you don't want to lean on too heavily, but having access to a few different reaction options is definitely a nice thing in Pathfinder 2e, and Swashbuckler is a class where you have plenty of good choices that you can pick up throughout play. Next up, let's talk about question number 3. What are the weaknesses of the Swashbuckler? And the first weakness is a little easy to overlook, but probably shouldn't surprise you when you think about the concept of the Swashbuckler. When you go for broke, well, sometimes broke is what happens. The Swashbuckler is, like some other classes in the game, a risk-reward style character where you take big risks and hope for the good rewards that come if the dice aren't too cruel to you. You tumble through the enemy space, you gain a tactical advantage and panache, and then you start dealing more damage and dropping brutal finishers. That's a really nice series of events, assuming the dice don't hate you when you attempt to tumble through. If you fail that roll, you're not gaining panache, and possibly even provoking an attack of opportunity or instigating some other negative consequence because, well, when you take a risk, sometimes you don't get the reward. Another thing to be aware of in this category is the Swashbuckler is a dex-based class, and oftentimes, due to a lot of fantasy games and movies and different media, we think of dexterity-based characters as being impossible to hit. That is not a part of Pathfinder 2e's design philosophy. Dex characters are not get out of taking hits for free. You will take hits in this game, and the armor class progression of the Swashbuckler is a little bit slower than some of the other martial characters, meaning you may end up taking more hits than you thought you would take. So, rushing into combat and trying to gain that perfect tactical position, that could be a huge risk if you get yourself surrounded and you don't have a way back out. Another weakness to be aware of when it comes to the Swashbuckler is there is no real ranged support for the Swashbuckler compared to other martial classes. Now, you are a dexterity-based class, so you're not going to be bad with a ranged weapon, but you're not going to have the array of cool abilities that a ranger or a rogue or even a dexterity-based fighter might be able to bring to play. You focus on getting up close and personal and battling in melee. And that means that as a Swashbuckler, you might struggle if you're in a situation where you really need ranged options to be effective. Sure, you've got the dexterity for it, but the lack of other ranged support is something you're going to feel in those situations. Also, the Swashbuckler is, how do you say this? Hangry. Okay, so the Swashbuckler is going to combine some issues that other classes in Pathfinder 2e have, and though the Swashbuckler is not as bad as other classes in either of these two categories, the combination of these two things puts the Swashbuckler in a unique place in terms of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and that is multiple attribute dependency and action hungry. First up, multiple attribute dependency. This is when a class needs multiple attributes in order to be effective in play. The Swashbuckler definitely needs dexterity, that's its core attribute, but it's also a melee class, meaning that you certainly want constitution and you probably need some strength, and then you also might be investing pretty heavily in charisma if you've taken one of these styles that builds off of a charisma skill. If you're trying to do a face version of a swashbuckler, you're going to need charisma to be effective in that role. Now, the swashbuckler avoids some of the extremes of multiple attribute dependency that other classes in Pathfinder 2e occasionally hit, but there are going to be a lot of situations where those 4 ability boosts that you get at every 5th level, they're going to be spent really quick. The other thing to be aware of is the Swashbuckler is an action-hungry class. Your finishers are going to use an action, and if you want to gain Panache, you have to spend an action. And you're a melee-oriented class, so you have to move to get into combat. The Swashbuckler is one of those classes where a lot of your actions get eaten up just so you can do the thing you want to do. You are certainly effective in your role, don't get me wrong, but it is easy to find yourself in a situation where you don't have quite enough actions to use all of the options that you would like to use during your turn. It's actually kind of weird. The Swashbuckler has a wealth of reactions, but can struggle in terms of their main action rotation. Are they as action hungry as some classes can be? Not necessarily, but it is still noticeable. And when you take a multiple attribute dependent class with an action hungry class and combine them together, it is easy to get into a situation where managing the right rotation is a little bit stressful. Alright, now that we've talked about strengths and weaknesses, let's move on to the subclass options for the Swashbuckler. And presently there are 5 options available as subclasses in the game. All of them can be found with the main Swashbuckler class in the Advanced Player's Guide. These are the Battledancer, the Braggart, the Fencer, the Gymnast, and the Wit. Now, each of these styles is going to do a few different things for you. They're going to give you training in a specific skill, and along with that skill, they're going to give you an additional official way to gain Panache. And then later on, you will also get an effect called an exemplary finisher, which is basically a tag-on effect when you use a finisher. Some styles will also have some other bonuses, but those are the 3 main things you need to be aware of. First up, we have the Battledancer style for the Swashbuckler, and this is a style that weaves performance into combat, giving you training in the performance skill and a free skill feat called Fascinating Performance. Now, Fascinating Performance is a skill feat that essentially allows you to distract creatures through your use of performance, and it specifically notes in the skill feat that you can use Fascinating Performance in combat, but it's only effective if you get a critical success against the creature. That is important because the Battledancer wants you to use Fascinating Performance inside of combat. The Battledancer still has to get a critical success in order to fascinate a creature with this skill feat, but the act of using Fascinating Performance will give you Panache even if you only roll a regular success. So it kind of expands the viability of Fascinating Performance, which is normally something you would avoid in combat. Swashbuckler makes it a little bit better. As for the exemplary finisher at higher levels, the Battledancer will get the ability to take a free step action after using a finisher. Our next style is one of the simplest, but also probably one of the most effective, and that is the Braggart style, which is going to give you training in intimidation and will allow you to gain Panache anytime you successfully use the Demoralize action in combat. Demoralize can make an enemy frightened, and if you've watched any videos on combat in Pathfinder 2e, you know that Frightened is a really nice debuff to hit your enemies with. So Braggart is essentially a style that debuffs your enemy before giving you nice bonus damage to hit that enemy with. Good combination. At later levels, Exemplary Finisher is actually going to improve Demoralize for you by removing any immunity that a creature might have to Demoralize when you use the finisher on them. Fencer is probably your most traditional style for a Swashbuckler, and this is going to give you training in the Deception skill and allow you to gain Panache anytime you successfully feint or create a diversion. It's a fairly plain approach to the Swashbuckler, but it is effective, And at higher levels, when you gain Exemplary Finisher, you can make the target of your finisher flat-footed, which is also a pretty potent debuff. One of the styles that really surprised me for the Swashbuckler when the APG came out is the Gymnast style, which gives you training in athletics and allows you to gain Panache anytime you successfully grapple, shove, or trip an enemy in combat. Now, athletics is a very broadly useful skill, and grapple, shove, and trip can allow you to manipulate enemies in a lot of interesting ways, so I think that the Gymnast opens up a very theatrical style of combat. A lot of people online really enjoy mixing the Gymnast Swashbuckler with the wrestler archetype, but in general, if you just want to push your enemies around and knock them prone on a number of occasions, the Gymnast style is the style for you. As for Exemplary Finisher at higher levels, this one's pretty simple. It gives you bonus damage when you use the finisher on an enemy that is grappled or prone, which is obviously something you've probably done to them. Now, as I pointed out back in section 1 of this video, the Gymnast style is a little bit more complicated because actions like grapple do have the attack trait, and so stringing them together in the right sequence with your finishers is a little bit more complicated, but this is still a very fun playstyle, and a lot of people online have spent some time talking about how fun the Gymnast Swashbuckler can be. This was something I didn't expect when Paizo announced the Swashbuckler, but I think it's a really cool inclusion. The final Swashbuckler style that you can choose is called the Wit style, and this particular style is going to give you training in the Diplomacy skill and a free skill feat from the APG called Bon mot. Bon mot is a special action that you can use with Diplomacy to essentially engage in a battle of wits or a verbal duel with your enemy, and you make a Diplomacy check and essentially try to throw them off their game because your words just hit them the right way. Bon mot is an action that allows you to inflict a perception and will save penalty on your enemies, and this can be a lot of fun. Now, Bon mot is a little bit complex. If this is a style that you want to take, you are going to need to read up on it because there are rules on how your opponents can try to throw your words back at you and try to break the condition of Bon mot. There's some nuance to how this works, but if you just enjoy that image of a battle of wits alongside a battle of blades, the wit style is incredibly fun, and to be honest, Diplomacy is one of the most broadly useful social skills in the game, so the wit style is just a classic example of how you can have the Swashbuckler be both a strong striker and very competent face for the party in Pathfinder 2e. Not surprisingly, the Wit style allows you to gain Panache by using Bon mot, and at later levels you can use Exemplary Finisher to give your enemy a penalty to attack as a result of your finishers. Now, before we leave styles, there is one more thing I want to discuss because I do think this is important. There is an aspect of the Swashbuckler feats that is not necessarily tied to a specific subclass, but you still want to be aware of. Essentially, there are certain feats that play well together and will have an effect on your playstyle. Commentary around the internet has kind of noted that the Swashbuckler has 3 real options in play. Option number 1 is a weapon and shield combo, often a weapon and buckler combo. Option number 2 is a weapon with a free hand, and then option number 3 is 2-weapon fighting. A lot of people who criticize the Swashbuckler class have noted that of the 3, the weapon and free hand is the most strongly supported combination, and I do think that is a fair assessment. The weapon and shield and the 2-weapon fighting version of the Swashbuckler, there is some class support there, but they are not as developed as the weapon and free hand version of the Swashbuckler, though I can kind of understand that because weapon and free hand is kind of the classic Swashbuckler fantasy, so I can see why Paizo leaned into that more. I do agree with some of the internet commentary out there that the weapon and shield and 2-weapon fighting needs some more support. I do hope Paizo releases more support in the future, but I would like to remind you of some of the advice I've mentioned in other videos on this channel. Don't forget that retraining rules are core in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, so there is no reason that your Swashbuckler has to stick to one of those combinations. It is completely valid for your Swashbuckler to use a weapon and buckler early in their career, and then switch to a weapon and a free hand, and then switch to 2-weapon fighting, and then switch back to one of the others. The circumstances of your adventure should certainly influence what approach your character is going to take, so don't forget that retraining rules exist so that you don't have to feel like you're locked into just one of those choices and that you have to pick one hoping that it's going to be useful all the time. But that brings us to our last question concerning the Swashbuckler, which is, how can I get the most out of the Swashbuckler in play? And the first piece of advice, the most important piece of advice, is going to be this: talk to your game master beforehand. Now, as we've gone through this video, we've mentioned Panache and gaining Panache several times. You can gain Panache by tumbling through, you can gain Panache by a specific action from your subclass, so every version of the Swashbuckler has 2 ways to gain Panache, and then it's noted in the Advanced Player's Guide that your Game Master can allow you to gain Panache in other situations, assuming you accomplish an appropriately exciting feat of some kind. And this is why talking to your Game Master is important. How your Game Master interprets that third option is going to affect how much fun you have with this class. Some Game Masters will probably lock you into the 2 options the game gives you and might not consider any other action at all. Other Game Masters may love the idea of over-the-top action and be more than willing to pass out Panache left and right. Your Game Master's interpretation of what qualifies for earning Panache is going to affect play, and this is a conversation you want to have before the game begins. It would be absolutely terrible to get into a campaign and to realize that your idea of what is a sufficient display of bravado is completely different from your Game Master. So let me just advise you, if you're going to play a Swashbuckler, talk to your Game Master first. Game Masters, by the way, I am personally of the opinion that it is better to be too generous than too stringent when it comes to abilities like this. The Swashbuckler is designed for the over-the-top play style, and I feel like it is rules as intended to be generous in this area. Now, I am personally a Game Master that loves over-the-top storytelling, so I don't have a problem in this area, but if you're a Game Master who doesn't like over-the-top, you may want to talk to your players who are considering playing a Swashbuckler and get a feel on what the right balance needs to be, because I do think this is an area where a Game Master should be generous. If you're too stringent, you're cutting into the core of what the class is supposed to do. Now, moving past that, there are some other things that I think can help you get a better experience out of the Swashbuckler, and one of them I haven't talked about for a really long time in this series: crit fishing. I told you back in section 1, the Swashbuckler is kind of a hybrid of the fighter and the rogue, and the fighter, in a lot of ways, is built around the idea of fishing for really fun critical hits. Well, Swashbucklers are too. The dream for a Swashbuckler is to land a finisher and roll well enough that it is a critical hit, and all of those bonus precise strike D6s are suddenly just pouring on the damage. As a Swashbuckler, you're going for big hits, and when you're looking for big hits, critical hits are the name of the game. Because of that, as a Swashbuckler, you kind of have to think a little more tactically than you might initially want to. You don't have the same legendary proficiency that a fighter's going to have, so you are a little behind the curve in terms of hitting that plus 10 to AC that you need to land a critical hit. As such, anything you can do to debuff your enemy or buff yourself is going to go a long way to improving your chances of landing a critical hit, which is necessary to make that burst damage all the more impressive. This is why I pointed out how powerful the Braggart is as a swashbuckler style earlier. The combination of demoralize and finishers, that's pretty brutal. That is an easy way to go crit fishing with this class. Obviously, any version of the swashbuckler can do this, but be sure to look into ways that you can debuff your enemies, get buffs from your allies, work with your team. Whatever it is you need to do to help yourself go crit fishing, do it with the swashbuckler, because you crit a finisher, you're going to be talking about that story for a while. The next important thing that I want to talk about with the swashbuckler is balancing the risk-reward aspect of the swashbuckler play. This is a class that likes to go over the top, it likes to do big things, it likes to take risks, but if you've seen some of the other videos on this channel, one thing you know is Pathfinder 2e is a game where characters that are by themselves can get overwhelmed very easily. And you're playing a martial class whose armor class progresses slower than other martials. I hope you see the problem here. Yes, as a swashbuckler, you want to take the big risks. Yes, as a swashbuckler, you want to get into melee, and you want to do your best to land those incredible blows, but be cognizant of where your character is, be cognizant of what your enemies are doing, and use that superior mobility that you have to make sure you're not getting overwhelmed, because otherwise, it's going to be a rough fight for you. And then last but not least, a lot of this video has been talking about the swashbuckler in combat because so much of their kit is built around the panache and precise strike and the finishers that they can do. There is such a heavy emphasis on this flashy combat style that it's easy to forget you are incredibly skilled. You are easily top 5 and arguably top 3 skill class in the game. You are a very skilled character, and skills in Pathfinder 2e can be a ton of fun. Don't skip out on your skill game. Look at the skills you have, look at the options available to you, and figure out how you can use those skills to unlock incredible moments inside of the game and give your team an advantage. I have frequently said on this channel that the Rogue is the most new player-friendly class in Pathfinder 2e because it is such a skill-heavy class inside of the game. And surprisingly, though the Swashbuckler is one of the more complex classes in the game, this is actually a class that I would strongly consider giving a new player because the skill game is so good. I think the Pathfinder 2e skill game is very new player friendly, and the Swashbuckler is actually a class that I think new players can have a lot of fun with. There's a little bit of a learning curve, but once you get used to that learning curve and find all of those fun skill tricks at your disposal, you're going to have a lot of fun things you can pull off. So, as a Swashbuckler, yeah, panache, precise strike, combat, you've got a lot of fun stuff to do there, but don't overlook your skill game. So the time has come to turn the conversation over to you. I will be throwing some links in the video description to some resources that I think are helpful if you're interested in playing a Swashbuckler, so definitely check those out. But beyond that, I encourage you to be part of this conversation. Jump down into the comments section and let me know what you think of the Swashbuckler. Do you agree with my analysis? Are there strengths or weaknesses that I missed? Or is there advice that you have for playing a Swashbuckler that I overlooked? Please leave a comment and let me know. Don't forget to do all of that other YouTube stuff. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Check out my free Discord and my Patreon. Classic introduction videos take a lot more work to do, so I appreciate the support. But as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.